when no one else has been. Check the code locks and strap yourself in.
Unless you've been living under a rock, you should know that I'm unfortunately a really big gamer. The thing that most of us can agree on is that video game soundtracks are fucking cool. It's a level of the art form that requires such fine precision to work with the game but also not be boring and bland and fucking horrible to listen to. Way back when, before what we could even consider the most primitive of technology, we didn't have sound chips capable of producing music. Most of the time it was just simple bloops and bleeps, with the ball hitting the paddle and pong. Sometimes we would use vinyl cassettes that would play music for you without needing an extra computerized piece of technology. That was too expensive and fragile to be maintained properly. Instead, what we did was we utilized chips that could produce a few or just even one specific sound to make simple melodies, like in Gunfight from 1975, where when someone gets shot, a simple melody plays. This is typically how it went for most games like Frogger, Pac-Man, Galaga, what have you. The first game to have truly melodic background music during gameplay was Rally X by Namco, released in 1980, where it had a rather minimal but still musical jingle during the gameplay. You can make the argument that something like Space Invaders was the first game with music, but that was only one channel of simple beeps, and some might say it wasn't melodic. Now to talk about how most sound was played, usually in the 80s, games utilized few waveforms, but waveforms that had a lot of character. Square waves, triangle waves, saw waves, and simple noise. This is how most sound was made for anything that has a motherboard and a screen, whether it be an arcade system, a Nintendo, a computer, what have you. And each system had its own level of character when compared to each other. On Nintendo's side, we had 2 square waves, 1 triangle wave, 1 noise channel, and 1 digital PCM sample channel, which I would like to get to later. Look at games like Contra, Castlevania, Mega Man, Life Force. They all can produce really good music with such limitations. And then there's games like Solstice, Rekka, and Castlevania 3 that just push the sound chip to its limits, creating what could be considered actual musical scores to most people. With the NES hardware, or well, more the Famicom, you could put extra chips in your cartridges to create more sounds, like Megami Tensei 2, and the Japanese version of Castlevania 3, adding more sound channels and more unique sounds. Like GRAAAHHH even was able to get full FM synthesis to work on the Nintendo. But to get to FM later, let's talk about the home computers and their sound hardware, where it's either minimalistic beeps somehow arranged in a melodic way like what you would hear in something like Monkey Island or Test Drive on the old IBM PCs. But then on something like the Commodore 64, you had 3 completely programmable channels, where you could set them to any sound wave, change them at whatever interval, have low-pass filters, and modulate the sounds to however you may please. And you can make music that's arguably even more complex than something you would hear on a Nintendo, or even most arcade boards. Games like Ghouls and Ghosts, Eliminator, and the original Turrican games have some of the best music in video game history. Some of these musicians from the computer land even made console music, like Tim Follin, who did Solstice and Pictionary, Chris Heelsbeck, who did the Turrican games on both the home computers and on consoles. Another method of generating sounds for video games is wavetable synthesis, which is just where you would have a set amount of waveforms that can emulate certain instruments, or just be their own thing, but I'm not smart enough to really get how it works entirely, so I haven't a clue on whether or not it's actually modular, or, like, you know, fucking not. Many of Namco's early 80s games like Pac-Man, Rally X, and Galaga would utilize wavetables, and some systems even, like the TurboGrafx 16 or the PC Engine, would also utilize it to create some of the best music man can ever listen to. Check out some games like the TurboGrafx version of Batman, Blazing Lasers, the Star Soldier games, Airzonk, R-Type, and Splatterhouse, and you can see how much of a unique sound you can get from such a chip. But then there's FM synthesis, or frequency modulation, which saw heavy use in the late 80s and early 90s on everything from computers to video games, or even pianos and keyboards in the home. FM had such a modular and customizable sound to it to where it can produce whatever you may want it to. Like maybe heavy metal on some games like Thunder Force 4, which may have the best soundtrack of all time, or maybe some club techno music in games like Streets of Rage 2. It has such an ability to create whatever you may like, but it still has a distinctive FM sound to it. FM synth is very very complex topic that even I can't get a grasp of, but it's effectively taken multiple sine waves with varying properties like attack, decay, length, amplitude, what have you, and combining them into one utilizing many different algorithms. There have been countless examples of how great FM can sound, like Contra Hardcorpse, Mega Turrican, Dynamite Heady, and Shinobi 3, where they can even work outside of the context of a video game and still be an incredible listen. There's also sample-based music, like what you would find on the Amiga and Super Nintendo, where you would take digital samples and just make music from them. Similar to wavetable synthesis, I think, but probably easier to do. Digital samples also got plenty of use on the Nintendo and Genesis for things like percussion and voice samples, but on the Amiga, you didn't just have one bitcrushed sample channel, you had 4, and on the Super Nintendo, 8. Meaning that you could effectively make whatever you may please. You can make anything from a rockin' soundtrack like Top Gear, but you can make more convincing, sort of symphonic and atmospheric music like Secret of Mana that might as well be CD quality. The sample technology also paved the way for soundtrackers on the Amiga, and later everything else that ever to have a sound chip, were games like Unreal, Jazz Jackrabbit, and like most modern indie games would use soundtrackers. With the 90s, we later got CD technology, and with that, we got systems like the PC Engine CD, Sega CD, PlayStation, 3DO, Saturn. Basically, CDs were all the rage, but they also changed music entirely for video games, where rather than generating or sequencing it on the fly, it's all done for you. It's one file and one line of code. I think. I'm not a programmer, and it basically made game soundtracks way easier to make and effectively can be whatever you may want it to be. Maybe your Sonic CD, doing something that's more like an arrangement of something you would hear on a Genesis, or maybe your Castlevania Rondo of Blood, where you're more like a mix of techno and more symphonic influences, or hell, your Lords of Thunder, and just felt like using your Metal Band's demo tape for the fuck of it. These early iterations of soundtracks on CD games, you can still tell they're video game soundtracks. By the time we got the PlayStation and Saturn, most people just effectively took the video game from video game soundtracks, and just made it soundtracks because games like Symphony of the Night,
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets.
all offering not just soundtracks, but fucking experiences. These soundtracks are so good that they were able to be given their own releases as albums to be listened to alone. This still is how most music works, albeit being slightly different in a technical matter. The small thing I forgot to mention with CDs is that this was where licensed soundtracks started to become a thing. While licensed soundtracks were a thing way before CDs ever existed, licensed music was a staple for 5th gen and 6th gen games. Prime examples are the Tony Hawk games, Grand Theft Auto, and even Dead Rising with... Now what did I want to tell you with this video? Mostly nothing. I just want to talk about how the ways video games utilize limitation to create amazing soundscapes and like the history of how music evolved from being so limited into a wide boundary breaking and like critically acclaimed portion of the music world. It's more than a genre. It's a fucking revolution. The soundtrack of a revolution. You know, say maybe that isn't a bad idea.